What are some of the most effective interventions you're aware of for facing up to our real emotions?
So this is really important. One of the things that I think many of us have found, even in the context of this pandemic, is there's no shortage of going onto Twitter or other aspects of social media and being flooded with things like, if you didn't use your time in quarantine to dust off your screenplay or to perfect sourdough bread baking, it's not that you didn't have a good idea, it's that you didn't have the discipline. And so we seem to live in a world that really conspires to make us feel bad about ourselves or always wanting or never good enough. And, now is not the moment for self-criticism. Now is the moment for self-compassion. And so one of the most important ways that we can start being emotionally agile is not to buy into this idea that there's these good and bad emotions, but rather to be compassionate with our feelings. And so what do I mean by this? For people listening, you've probably over the past couple of weeks or months or years experienced a full range of emotions. They might have been things like joy and relief, not to go into the office every day. But there's also for many people an overwhelming sense of grief or loneliness, stress, anxiety, disappointment, cynicism. There's so much that we as people, we as humanity have been experiencing. And it's so tempting to paper over that with, I've just got to get on with it and I've just got to be positive. But one of the most profound ways that we can be effective human beings is to be compassionate with ourselves. So, there's this beautiful phrase in South Africa, which is the phrase sawubona. And sawubona literally translated means, I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. And what's remarkable about this phrase is it's a greeting. It's a Zulu greeting. You hear it every day on the streets. Sawubona, yebo sawubona. But the literal translation is, I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. And a core part of emotional agility is this idea that it's very difficult to see other people. It's very difficult to see our family or to see our colleagues at work if we refuse to see ourselves. And so seeing ourselves, what do I mean by that? If we're experiencing emotions, those emotions are difficult. And there's nothing weak or lazy or banned in experiencing these emotions. They're human emotions. And so the first aspect of emotional agility that's really important is this idea of self-compassion, which is not something we often talk about, particularly for people who are very high functioning and high thriving. Self-compassion can sometimes feel like it's being weak or lazy or letting yourself off the hook. But I'll invite people who are listening to come with me on a little mental journey to something that all of us have experienced. You're in a restaurant and you see a child. It might even be your own child. And the child's, 18 months old, 2 years old, and there's something really remarkable that happens. The child is maybe at the table with its parents or caregivers, and then it gleefully runs away from the table. And as the child is running away from the table, it turns around, it looks at its parents or caregiver, laughs, and then runs away even further. And so what is happening here is something really profoundly important. It's very magical what is going on here. And that is that the child, as it turns around and sees its caregivers, it basically has this idea, and this is an idea that John Bowlby, one of the most beautiful psychologists, wrote about, this idea of a secure base. So the child has this idea that because my caregivers are there, because they will be able to jump in if something happens to me, this actually gives me permission to explore and to run and to take risks and to be curious, and yes, even to run away from them. And so there's this really beautiful thing that's going on, which is the knowledge that the child has that someone has their back is what actually allows the child to move forward and explore. So how does this apply to emotional agility? How does this apply to self-compassion? Well, in the same way. When we as human beings know that we have our own back, that when something goes wrong, if we fail in a project, if our entrepreneurial activity doesn't work out, if something doesn't go well in a relationship, we have our own back. We will still look after ourselves. We will care for ourselves. We won't judge ourselves. We won't punish ourselves. We won't tell ourselves that we're just stupid. When we have our own back, that actually allows us to explore, to take risks, to be curious and grow. And so even though self-compassion is not often something that we think of in high-functioning, goal-setting, go-getting individuals, actually it is one of the most profoundly important cornerstones to our ability to be whole in the world. It's the essence of what allows us to actually thrive, to be honest with ourselves. And therefore, it will be no surprise that people who are more self-compassionate actually are less likely to be dishonest with themselves. They are more motivated. They're less likely to let themselves off the hook. So there are a number of aspects of emotional agility that are really important, but I think it's very difficult to be effective with our own and other people's emotions, especially in a fast-paced, complex and changing world, if we are unable to just love ourselves, to love ourselves. And if it's helpful, I can give you some ideas of what that might look like practically, but this is really very important.